Holly Near. It's a Holly Near song. It's a good one. Thank you all. This is harder than I thought it would be. I'll just need a second. I'll try not to blow my nose when I haven't muted my mic. I'll do my best. Last summer, on July 11th, Lisa and I woke up in our cabin in Fairplay, Colorado. We usually spend several weeks in the summer up there. And over the years, we've attended worship at different Colorado churches. That day, we were headed to Colorado Springs to visit one of our favorites, First Congregational Church. By coincidence, our friend Don Longbottom happened to be serving as their interim pastor. I texted him earlier to let him know that we'd be there and that we looked forward to seeing him. The first time we visited First Congo in Colorado Springs, yes, they call themselves First Congo sometimes too. And the first time Lisa and I visited there was in July of 2018, 4 years ago. They had recently called a new pastor. She was very charismatic, and the church was hopping that morning. Full house, lots of kids, great energy. At the time, I remember thinking, gosh, this would be a great congregation to serve. Of course, they had just called this pastor, so I thought, oh, they're going to be set for a while. That was in 2018. And at that point, I imagined that I would begin looking for a new church, perhaps in 2020. You see, I've long held the opinion that churches have the best chance to thrive if a pastor stays for 8 to 10 years or so. If the ministry is going well, that's enough time to get to know folks, to engage deeply in whatever ministry the congregation is called to do. And if it's not going well, it gives everybody a reset. I have seen pastors stay longer, and sometimes successfully. But what often happens is that things get stagnant. Churches need to keep reinventing themselves and not expecting their pastor to do that for them. It's a very valuable practice that might not happen unless a church finds itself without a pastor for a time. And if pastors stay too long, they might get lulled into a kind of stagnancy too. They might begin to just settle into long-established patterns and neglect their own discernment, renewal, or spiritual growth. It doesn't always happen, of course, but I've seen it happen. A pastor stays too long, and the church or the pastor just drift into a sort of sluggishness. Or if the pastor has been there for 20, 25, 30 years, as sometimes happens, it's even more difficult for a new pastor to come in and be successful. That's where the phrase unintentional interim comes from. A new pastor comes in and everybody just expects them to be exactly like the old pastor because nobody can remember any other pastor. So churches need those times of transition in order to sustain a longer-term trajectory of vitality. For a healthy church, the trick is to make the change before the church becomes sluggish or the pastor gets bored. Timing is everything. I've also always strived to be the kind of pastor who is mindful of what she is called to do, rather than just drift along. I've tried to discern what is needed at whatever church I've served. In my opinion, churches need pastors. The world needs people who are intentional and mindful. And I've tried to be that kind of person and pastor. Back to our story. When Lisa and I visited First Congregational Colorado Springs way back in 2018, I joined their mailing list. I began to keep an eye on them, not because I thought I might someday serve there, but just because I got so many good ideas from their newsletters. I'm always looking around at other churches that I respect, keeping an eye on what they do, trying to learn from them. I know other pastors keep their eye on our church. First Congo, Colorado Springs, was one of the churches with great ideas. And as I told them last weekend, I stole a few of their ideas over the years and have implemented them here. In 2019, after I had read their newsletters for a year or so, it became clear that the pastor I had seen earlier was struggling. The church was struggling. She had only been there for less than 2 years when I read her letter of resignation late in 2019. Shortly after, I learned that the congregation was indeed having a very difficult time with deep conflict and pain. These things happen in congregations for a variety of reasons. It was pretty clear that that's where this church found themselves. And then in 2020, a little over 2 years ago, I learned that a gifted interim pastor was on his way to Colorado Springs, and I knew him well. Don Longbottom had recently resigned as conference minister of the South Central Conference, our conference here. He resigned and he became the interim pastor in Colorado Springs. What a weird coincidence. That was in March of 2020. Do you remember what else happened in March of 2020? COVID hit. Like most churches, we suspended in-person worship, and we all entered the pandemic world that lingered so much longer than we thought it would, and that has been so very challenging in so many ways, on so many levels. Every pastor, every person I know has struggled to get through those 2+ years. In ministry, I just put my head down and took it day by day. The weeks blurred into months, the months into years. I didn't realize it at the time, but as I look back on it, that's how it feels. Every week, the only parishioners I saw were the tech team, the stream team. Not only did you wonderful folks in the balcony get the church through by producing live stream worship, in many ways you got me through, and I thank you for that. In July of 2020, I know it's a little hard to keep track of the timeline, but we're July of 2020, a few months into the pandemic. Lisa and I drove up to the cabin. None of the churches, that I might have wanted to attend were meeting in person. So we worshiped on live stream. We worshiped here through the live stream. And a year later, July 2021, last summer, we were back at the cabin, and we learned that First Congo in Colorado Springs had just resumed in-person worship. The COVID numbers at the time were better up there. So I texted Don to let him know that we were coming to worship on July 11th, last summer. For a variety of reasons, I had long since lost any interest in serving there. I was exhausted by the pandemic. I couldn't even conceive of looking for another church at that time. We were still in the pandemic. And I was committed to seeing this church through. Plus, in all honesty, I wasn't sure what had happened with that previous pastor. First Congo, Colorado Springs is a large church. It's a historic church. And like all churches, they had struggled with COVID, and then I suspected that the conflict might be lingering. That morning, last summer, Lisa and I went to church there. As worship began, I was participating as a congregant with absolutely no sense of scoping it out to see if I might want to serve there. I was not interested. I was firmly convinced I did not. Lisa and I entered the sanctuary that day. We sat on the last row of pews All you last rowers, I'm one of you. Dead middle in the sanctuary. I wanted to just see how everything unfolds in worship. The pipe organ began, and I just settled in. And I don't know how to describe what happened to me during the service. As I sat there, a part of another beautiful congregation, I just felt my heart open. I looked at the chancel, and there was Don standing there preaching, and all of a sudden, I just saw myself there. It was a mystical moment of clarity. And I thought, this church is the next chapter of ministry for me. This church needs me, and I think I need this church. Without knowing nearly as much about them as I now know, I saw a congregation was ready for healing, ready for a pastor who could help them move forward. No one was more surprised than me to have that sense of awakening that morning. At the time, the position was not yet open. They hadn't written their profile. Churches write profiles, and so do pastors. And I had not updated my profile in almost 10 years. And plus, even if I saw myself standing up there, I had no idea if they saw me that way. But my experience in worship that day was so compelling to me that I took it very, very seriously. I can only compare it to my initial call to ministry. Both left me with this strong sense that the next chapter of my life was opening up, that I needed to pay attention to it. And I did. Over the next months, I began to put together my ministerial profile, which, by the way, is a giant exhaustive effort. Are you listening, all you members in discernment in this congregation? Get started on your profile now. When Colorado Springs opened their search, I submitted my profile. It is the only church to whom I submitted my profile. I was not in general search. I was called to that church. Now, search and call doesn't always work out that way, but in this instance, it did for me. Months of interviews on Zoom and then later in person took place. And at every step, my compelling sense of call to Colorado Springs was confirmed for me, and later I learned for them. Then, of course, last weekend, Lisa and I flew there for a candidate weekend. On Friday afternoon, I met individually with each of their staff of 6. Friday night, Lisa and I met with their council for a time of introduction and conversation and really delicious desserts. Saturday morning, the full congregation was invited to a Q&A, followed by a meet and greet. Sunday morning was worship, of course, along with their very gifted staff. I planned worship, then I preached. And as always happens with a candidate sermon, at the postlude, the candidate leaves the sanctuary while the congregation talks about them and votes. Lisa and I slipped off to one of the offices. We called it at the time Don's office. Now we call it my office. And the waiting game began to hear how the congregation would vote. By the way, guess who waited with us? Former members of our congregation, Bethany Potter and Daniel Moran. They moved to Denver last year. And by the way, with permission, I'm sharing with you that Daniel has claimed a new name for themselves, Piper. I asked them if it was okay to share that with y'all, and they said they wanted me to. So Bethany and Piper drove down from Denver to Colorado Springs for worship, and they waited with us. It seemed like forever passed. Didn't it seem like a long time sitting in that office? But it really wasn't that long before we heard the knock on the door. I had told them that I needed at least a 90% affirming vote. There are almost always some no votes in these kinds of situations for a variety of reasons. As it turned out, of the 205 votes, only members could vote, 98% voted to call me as their lead pastor. And now I'm back home for the hard part. Pastoral transitions are complex. For the pastor, for me, there is joy and gratitude for sacred call to a new congregation, one to love and serve. And there is the grief of letting go of the congregation I've loved and served for almost 10 years. Hebrews 12:1 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the burdens that cling so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us." In my heart, I know something of the path laid out before me. And now, this congregation knows something of the path laid out before you. First Congo Fort Worth has never been my church. And maybe it's not even your church. Not precisely, at least. I believe that this church is here for a greater purpose. I believe so deeply in what we're doing here in Fort Worth. We need to be here. You need to be here. At least a part of both of our journeys is to grieve. Emily, I loved your kids' time, to be open and appreciative of all of our emotions, to give thanks for this beautiful chapter of ministry that we have shared together, and also to look for what is to come. Picking up on the metaphor in Hebrews of life as a race set before us, pastoral transition is sort of like a relay, passing the baton from one pastor to the next. I'll be passing the baton to the next pastor, who will someday pass the baton to the next. I'll tell you that this church will be very appealing to any progressive pastor looking for a healthy, happy church where they can be themselves. Not every church is like that. With a new pastor will come new gifts to share, new ways that this church can grow and serve, and you will thrive. And until that new pastor gets here, we are so fortunate to have many gifted pastors and student pastors among us. We're sharing in communion today, and I somehow thought I just wouldn't be able to handle it. And so I have asked forward my friend and colleague, Kathy Bowser.